And President Joe Biden is calling for mandatory COVID jabs for 80 million plus unvaccinated Americans. Does he have the authority to force U.S. citizens to accept a vaccine they don't want? And will religious exemptions hold up his federal order? Joining us now to discuss is attorney at the Center for American Liberty and the Dhillon Law Group, Harmeet Dhillon. Harmeet, thanks for being here. I want to play you something Biden said before he took office regarding the COVID vaccine. Watch.
No, I don't think it should be mandatory. I wouldn't demand to be mandatory, but I would do everything in my power, just like I don't think masks have to be made mandatory nationwide. I'll do everything in my power as the President of the United States to encourage people to do the right thing.
Now, when asked if he thought COVID vaccines should be mandatory, he said no. Now the Biden administration's looking to impose those vaccine mandates on private businesses with 100 or more employees. As an alternative to taking the vaccine, employees can submit to weekly COVID tests at their own or their employer's expense. Now, I know the administration's executing this order through the Department of Labor, Harmeet. Is this mandate legal? Is it constitutional?
I don't think it's legal or constitutional, Raymond, and I think that part of the timing that you're seeing here is because the administration is in so much trouble with scandals, and also President Biden has let the power that he has as president go to his head. He's not heeding the constitutional guardrails that the United States Supreme Court set up with respect to, for example, that eviction moratorium, and this is all sort of the same type of issue. So just to break it down for you, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration has certain power, and that's under the Department of Labor, to regulate safety in the workplace. But this rule is being made under an emergency aspect of its power. And so the question really legally is, did Congress delegate to the Department of Labor and OSHA the power to force vaccines into American citizens' arms? This has never been done before, and in fact, just weeks ago, OSHA, put out regulations saying we're not planning to mandate this. And so, in order to meet the standard here, the OSHA has to prove, in response to a challenge, and there will be challenges. I plan to file one of those challenges, that we're dealing with a grave and immediate threat of some contaminant in the workplace. And you may recall from President Biden's remarks on this that he's calling the citizens who are unvaccinated, the Americans or the workers who are unvaccinated, the contaminant, not even the virus. And so that doesn't hold water scientifically, as we all know. We all know friends and family who've gotten sick with this virus despite being vaccinated. And they got it from people who were vaccinated. So just the basic logic doesn't hold up, but there are many other issues I can go into.
Well, I agree. That's a whole secondary issue that we don't even have time to get into. But, science, as I say, week after week, I'm all for following the science, but science evolves as new discoveries, new information, and new data comes in. And what we know about these vaccines is they're leaky. We are having bleed through, where people are getting sick after being vaccinated. I know at least 3 people who have COVID now, all double vaxxed. And if that wasn't true, we wouldn't see the push for booster shots, which are coming now. And we're not even talking about the Mu variant, which apparently cuts through all these vaccines. So that's another issue for another day.
Right.
But I want to talk about, you mentioned OSHA. OSHA gains its authority from the Commerce Clause. The Obamacare mandate had the controversial point there was the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And John Roberts said that mandate, the Obamacare mandate, was a tax. Might they say this is a $14,000 tax for anybody who doesn't get the vaccine? And could that pass muster at the Supreme Court?
I don't think so, because OSHA doesn't have the power to tax. Neither does the Department of Labor. And so I don't think that's not going to fly at all. I think that really looking at, there's so many other legal issues. You mentioned religious exemptions and medical exemptions and so forth. I know we're going to get to that. But as an employment lawyer, as part of what I do at my law firm, I can tell you that, and as an employer, I have no desire as an employer to know the medical issues of my workers, because it creates liability for me. If I find out that a worker has a disorder or disease or medical reason not to get vaccinated, I don't want to know about it because if I end up firing that person, they're going to sue me for disability discrimination because I knew their medical situation. And so there's so if you were to call this a tax, the tax is not just the fine if you don't do it. The tax is setting up the weekly testing. The tax is setting yourself up for lawsuits. The tax is adding HR professionals to track and monitor this stuff. And by the way, if they get away with doing this, we are going to be subjected to this for the flu vaccine and for every new drug that American pharmaceutical corporations that donate money to politicians decide they'd like to push with the help of the government and with the help of big employers. Now, what's interesting is that some big employers, and frankly, a lot of blue state governors, I think, are in favor of this mandate. And that is because citizens and workers who have choices and decide whether they've gotten vaccinated or not, they don't think it's their employer's business. They're mobile right now before this rule goes into effect. They can decide to go work for a different company or move or what have you. This rule, in one fell swoop, eliminates American worker mobility and choice between different companies. So it eliminates competition. And big companies like that. They like their workers to have no choices and to stay locked in.
That's a great point that I hadn't thought of. Now, during the press conference last week, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki had this to say about the administration's latest vaccine mandate. Listen to the question she was asked.
Well, look, our objective is to get as many people vaccinated across the country as humanly possible. And so the president's announcement yesterday was an effort to empower businesses, to give businesses the tools to protect their workforces. That's exactly what we did.
But it's a requirement for people at a business with more than 100 people. It is not a requirement for migrants at the southern border. Why?
That's correct.
So on Tuesday, Harmeet, Arizona became the first state to file a lawsuit against Biden's latest COVID vaccine requirements. Arizona's Attorney General Mark Brnovich argues that the mandate is unconstitutional because it discriminates against U.S. citizens, because undocumented immigrants apprehended by federal law enforcement are not subject to this vaccine requirement. Neither is Congress or the White House or certain unions. Are those carve-outs, the discriminatory application of this mandate, a problem?
Well, I think those are going to be among the many arguments that are used. I mean, the OSHA hasn't published the regulations as yet, and so I haven't filed a lawsuit as yet, but among the arguments is going to be equal protection. But even before you get to that, the federal government does not have police power to do this. They do have the ability under OSHA to sort of stop extreme threats, exploding gases or toxic waste in the workplace, but that's not what this is, and I don't think it passes the historical precedents either. The fact that we have today thousands of people on the border waiting to get in, they're not vaccinated, they're not going to be vaccinated, they're spreading measles and other diseases. This is documented in our country, and American citizens are held to this different standard. Look at the rhetoric that Jen Psaki used. The president is giving workplaces the tools, and we want to get people vaccinated. They're doing it by force. Force is faster and more convenient for the government to achieve its goals on its populace than persuasion, than incentives. And it's brutal because we have a majority of people in most of our states. In California, where I live, it's 70% of adults plus are vaccinated. Right. In San Francisco, where I'm sitting, it's over 80%. And so when you look at those numbers, and what is the need for the force? Those numbers exceed so-called herd immunity. You notice that nobody's talking about herd immunity anymore. You notice that nobody's talking about the fact that people who don't get vaccinated may have had the disease. Over 100 million people in this country have survived this illness, and that is not being counted. So there have been lawsuits, Raymond, regarding discrimination against people who have survived COVID and have natural immunity. Right. My friend Todd Zwicky at the George Mason Law School filed a lawsuit like that. He's a professor there, and the school backed down, and they said, we will treat you as if you are vaccinated, because he had a medical opinion that said it is dangerous for him to get vaccinated, having recently recovered from COVID, given his medical condition.
I got to get to religious freedom here, which is also at stake. There are people who do not want to take this vaccine due to sincerely held religious beliefs. This week, a federal judge in New York sided with 17 Catholic and Baptist medical professionals and issued a temporary restraining order in New York State, forbidding them from enforcing the vaccine mandate if healthcare workers claim a religious exemption. Now, if they're not forced to take the vaccine, but then are forced to pay these weekly COVID testing, to this test regime, is that an undue burden, Harmeet? And what do you expect on this religious liberty front?
Well, so when you look at state law regarding employment, that's where most of our employment laws are made. And in many states, like California, like many other more liberal states, an employer cannot make you go do a work obligation on your own dime and on your own time. The employer has to pay you for the time spent taking the test and has to reimburse you for the expenses. So actually, I think that's an additional tax. But on the religious mandate issue, and I think, look, if employers are going to pay for it and it's going to be on site, and frankly, it would be logical if employers are concerned about this to make everybody test, because as we know, vaccination does not prevent transmission or even illness, right? So that would actually be much more logical. If the employer is going to pay for that, the government's not going to mandate that, because that would be a hue and cry from big business to put that additional tax burden on them. And so that case you just mentioned, however, I'm sorry to say that is an outlier. Unfortunately, since an opinion by Justice Scalia about 30 years ago regarding religion and exemptions from employment requirements, religion has really had second-class status among the rights in the First Amendment. Unfortunately, that may be sort of slightly shifting with some lawsuits that I filed last year regarding COVID restrictions. But right now, the law is that it's a very low threshold. So if the employer can prove that your religious exemption is going to cause the employer more than what's called a de minimis burden, like a very minor expense, if it's more than a minor expense, they don't have to accommodate you, even if you can prove your sincerely held religious belief that compels you not to get vaccinated. So, that's bad news for employees. And now with a mandate, those employees who get fired from one job are not going to be able to get a job at a big company. They may still be able to get a job at a small company, but I predict that states like New York and California are going to mandate this vaccination requirement for companies under 100 workers. So that could definitely happen at the state level, and then we're going to have even more litigation.
Harmeet, before I let you go, there is something that I did not appreciate until I read some case law today. I did not realize that to claim a religious exemption, many times the federal courts, the Supreme Court, looks to the religious body that you claim. So what that means is, in the context of these vaccine mandates, might the stance of the bishops or the Pope be used against Catholics trying to make a religious exemption argument here vis-a-vis these vaccines?
Yes, absolutely. The jurisprudence does show that the courts look to whether you have a sincerely held religious belief, and that means a religion in the sense of an organized faith, not just your personal beliefs. And so if your organized faith doesn't support your religious exemption, that would be a reason to say that you are not expressing a sincerely held religious belief, but rather your personal viewpoint, which is not protected by that exemption.
Wow, that was a stunner to me today. I just always thought it was an individual claim, a conscience claim. But apparently, it's far more cut and dried, which is why every bishop's statement, the Pope's statement on vaccines, all of that will factor in at the end of the day. Harmeet Dhillon, thank you for the insight, your clarity. We will check in with you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond.